Hi, so this is gonna be a video tutorial on how to make your own fur ears. So I recommend watching this video all the way through and then reading the instructions. That way you have a better understanding on what you'll be doing, when you'll be doing it, and what supplies you'll need before you start. So yeah, right now we're gonna get started on making the pattern. The pattern is what we use to cut out the fur shape, and then also we use it to cut out the insert. So yeah, let's get to that. So you're gonna need some regular printer paper and a pencil for this. You're gonna wanna draw out the ear from the front view with the fluff and everything. So not from like an angle, not from this angle, but like straight forward how the ear is gonna look when you're looking at it directly from the front. And even here, you can even already see the outline that the ear has. The ears that I make are also curved, so we'll also be adding an extra bit of length on this side only to accommodate for that curve that it's gonna have. So I actually already have it drawn out here. This is the regular Bixby pattern that we have, and you can see I drew out the ear, how it's gonna look, the size it's gonna be. I drew out the fluff, but the fluff isn't really that important. It's more for later when you start trimming. But you can see right here, this is where I'm gonna add that extra edge for that curve fold over. And I'm only going about halfway than the fluff that I want to add. This will vary depending on what pattern you're making. Sometimes you want it a little bit longer. If you are making it longer, I recommend curving it up. So starting from this point on the drawing, you're gonna want to kind of angle it up. I didn't really angle this one up because it doesn't have much of a fold over, but you're gonna want to angle up like that. So when it's sitting on the ear and you fold it over, it doesn't kind of go into your head and push the ear backwards. It leans forward, kind of like a cat ear or a dog ear, how it kind of has a more forward lean. But yeah, so once you have that, you'll actually want to get a headband and kind of put it next to the pattern. This is how you're gonna get the size of the curve. You're not gonna want to draw it exactly directly, but it looks like I drew this one directly actually. So for certain sets that aren't gonna be curved on both ends, you can just draw it kind of along the line, though I don't recommend like going within like sharper than this curve, because when you put on the ear, the headband, it'll actually stretch out the headband. So you see how the curve changes slightly. So always keep in mind the curve and the stretch of the headband when you're making the bottom of the ear. Normally for my bigger sets, I'll actually make it wider. That way it's not kind of like smushing the pattern. But yeah, so once you have this drawn out, you already have your pattern, you're gonna want to cut it out. So I cut it out right here, and this is what the pattern is gonna look like. I like to roll over the edge like this and then put it on my head so to see how it looks. And if you need to make any adjustments, you kind of have to use your imagination a bit here to kind of imagine how far the fluff's gonna sit on the pattern and fill out the rest of the shape of the ear. Now that you have your pattern, you actually want to go ahead and design your ear. When picking out the fur color for the front specifically, you actually want to pick it out based off of the lightest color. Majority of the time I use white since it's an easy blank canvas to airbrush any color on, especially if you are doing like rainbow colors and pastel colors. But if you want a different shade for the front, I would recommend picking out the lightest color that will be on the ear for the front fur. An example of that is this set right here. So you can see that the back fur is going to be black. The front is going to have minty tones, blue tones, and black. You actually want to pick out the front fur based off of the lightest one, which seems to be this minty shade right here. That way you can airbrush the darker shades on top of it and the black, instead of picking out a darker shade like the darker blue and then trying to build up the pigment of the light teal or the light mint, which will end up taking a bunch of layers and can lead to the paint clumping up if you add too much paint onto it, and it doesn't look as good or seamless when you do that. So I recommend picking out a light fur color for the front. Usually pastels work really well. And white is the one I go through the most, especially for the front. When picking out the back fur, you can go ahead and pick out whatever color you want, since you're not going to be doing much detailed airbrushing on the back. Unless you plan to, then you can go ahead and pick out a lighter shade. So now that you have your ear design ready, you know what fur colors you're going to be using, you want to get the fur that you will be using for the back first. So I have this minty green right here. You can see that the fur has a direction in which it's flowing, and it's currently flowing up like that. To check or double check, if you look at one end, you can see that the fur is coming off of this edge. But then when you go to this side, there is no fur coming off of this edge, so it lets you know that the direction that the fur pile is flowing is up this way. And that's how you want to have it when you are going to cut out the ears. So when you get your pattern, you want to make sure, if you're doing both ears, you want to make sure you're cutting out the right sides and marking them off. And yeah, so you want the fur going up in this direction. We're going to be doing the back first, since it's slightly easier than the front. Now, the way that I like to align the pattern to the fur is going from the center of the tip. I like to draw a line down so I can see where I'm going to align the pattern. And you can see that it goes down like that. You want this line to match up with the direction of the fur, so to be parallel with the direction that it's flowing. So you can kind of see it's going that way. And this is how I'm going to cut it out, or outline it first and then cut it out. I like to use a Jelly Roll pen, but if you have any fabric markers, you can also use those. I use this one since the ink seems to sit on top of the fabric and doesn't leak through. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and make sure I have some room on the edges, and then I'll go ahead and draw the outline. So now that I have the outline done, I marked it off as the left back just to make sure that I don't mix up the patterns. And now you want to go ahead and get an X-Acto knife. I recommend an X-Acto knife since it's easier for me to cut the fur without damaging the actual fur on the back. So it just cuts the fabric. I use this one from Fiskars. It has a big like handle on it, so it's more comfortable, especially when you're like cutting out a bunch of patterns. But you can use a pair of scissors. I just recommend when you're cutting it, you kind of have to scrape the tip or the point of the scissors along the fabric on the fur side to avoid cutting any of this fur, because you want to keep it, make sure it's long until you get to the seaming and trimming stage. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut this out. When you're cutting this out, you want to actually cut around the edge and not directly on the outline. This also helps avoid damaging the fur, since you will need it for the seaming step. Okay, so now that we have this cut out, you can see how I left some space along the edge. We'll be cleaning that up after we cut out the front pattern. So we'll go ahead and get the fur we will be using for the front. And since we cut out the left back for this one, we're gonna want to flip it around. That way, when you put the two fabric edges together, they will have the fur side sticking out. So for this one, you're gonna want to angle it different compared to the first one. So when you look at our sketch right here with the fluff, you can kind of see that majority of the fluff is going out like that. So that means you're gonna want to angle the pattern where majority of the fluff is, again, going in that same direction. So you can see that's how we cut this one. We're gonna go ahead and flip it like that to cut the front out. And you can see that I kind of go off of this corner and trying to get it to a line going up that way, because then it's easier to brush the fur out this way. So that's how I would align it, like that. So not off of the tip like that, but turning it to its side so that the fur is coming out at an angle. So I'm gonna go ahead and outline this and then cut it out. Now we have both the front and the back cut out. If you're doing a new pattern, you're gonna want to test out one ear, but if you're using a good pattern that you know works, you'll go ahead and do this twice, but making sure to do the opposite. So you see how this is this direction for the left back ear. You're going to want to cut out the green in this direction for the right back ear, and then the white in this direction for the right front ear. So now we're going to clean up the edges, and just how I explained earlier with cutting the fur out with scissors, you're basically going to use that same technique to trim around the edges. So you're going to want to make sure it's kind of scraping the back side of this fabric where the fur's at, and then just trim along the edge like that. I like to go outside of the outline, but whichever one you prefer, inside or outside of the outline, you want to make sure to continue to do that so the ears don't change in sizes. We're trying to make them as symmetrical as we can, so whichever one you pick, you want to go ahead and stick to that. Now that you have them both cleaned up on the edges, you want to go ahead and kind of tug on the edges to grab any excess fur that is loose, just to clean it up and to avoid getting fur everywhere. Now we're ready to cut out the insert. So I use this brand of watercolor paper. I make sure to get the 300-gram one since the cardstock is like extra thick on it. I have tried using foam, and I know a lot of people do use foam, but I found that when using foam and hot glue, they do not mix really well, and the foam will melt when the hot glue is applied onto it, which will create a bumpy surface. And since we're going to be airbrushing on the front, we want to try to create as smooth of a canvas as we can. It's a lot sturdier, it's nice and flat, it's not too thick, so we can make sure that the ears are still nice and thin, especially on the edges. Yeah, so we're gonna get our pattern, and when cutting out the insert, it really doesn't matter what direction your pattern is laying, since it's gonna be on the inside of the ear anyway. But I'd like to lay it out as close to the edge as I can to try to get the most out of one sheet. So maybe like that should be good. And then I'm gonna go ahead and outline it. Now that we have it outlined, you either want to take a pair of scissors or X-Acto knife, and instead of cutting directly on the line, you're gonna want to cut within the line, at least a good portion, so you can kind of see that's where I'm going to be cutting all around, leaving a good amount on the edge. So now that you have your insert cut out, you can see when you line it up on the fur, there's a good amount along the edge. I like to do this since for my style, I prefer the ear to be thicker in the center and then taper out on the edges, so the edges are nice and thin for a more natural look, or you know, as natural as you can get with it. You also want to make sure your glue gun is going, so I like to use this small Gorilla Glue gun. It works pretty good. It lasts, this is the second one I've had since, I don't know, for like 5 years of making ears, so they actually last pretty good. And the mini one just, it's not as heavy or bulky as other glue guns I've used. I also like to use these mini long sticks, that way you have more time using the glue instead of constantly having to add in a new glue stick. When it comes to attaching the insert, you always want to attach it onto the front first. So this is going to be the front fur piece. You want to glue it down onto this piece. That way this piece is the one that is as smooth as we can get it for airbrushing. I like to do it in small sections and making sure the layer is as thin as I can get it, so it's not creating bumps on the front, which could lead to you accidentally trimming a hole into the front fabric when you are cutting the fur. So I do it in that kind of a motion and then just place it real quick and press it down. And I'll go ahead and do that in small sections for the rest of it. You also want to be careful when pressing it down, since sometimes the glue can kind of leak out from the edges if you put a little too much on the edge, and you don't want to burn your fingers, so just be careful when you're pressing it down. Now, when it comes to wiring the ears, you want to make sure you're picking out the right wire size for the ear that you're making. So since this one's a medium to big, you can go ahead and use an 18 gauge or like a 10 gauge. I would avoid using a 12 or a 14 gauge since you want to use those on bigger sets. The Hildy and Joe I found to work really good. You want to try out a few different wires. These are just the ones that I found to work really good, especially the artistic wire. But if you know any other wire brands that you know work pretty good, you can go ahead and use those instead. I'm going to be using the 10 gauge for this set just because it's a slightly bigger set. I like to leave it on the roll, and for the raw cut end, I'll actually go ahead and add a little bit of glue. That way it caps it off and avoids any accidental poking with the wire. While still having it on the roll, I'll go ahead and straighten out one end of it and try to get about maybe 5 to 7 inches of extra space on the end. Actually 8 inches. Let's do 8 inches. So you want to do about 8 inches on the end that are sticking out. And I always start off with the inner corner since it's easier to measure this part out. And I'll go ahead and slightly bend it when it comes to that little fold over edge. And I'll go ahead and glue this down with a little dab on both sides of the wire. Now that that is cooled, I'll go ahead and slightly bend it some more and kind of kink it where the fold over edge, like the extra added part, kind of goes back into the original pattern, and kink it right there. And then I'll go ahead and curve it up to the tip, and then I'll add a drop of glue right where I kinked it at. You want to make sure you're also adding the wire on top of the insert and not onto the fabric on the outer edge, because the wire will warp the fur fabric or stretch it. That way you have a sturdy base when you're putting it on the insert. Now you want to go ahead and use your nail, like your thumbnail, and kind of press. You can also use some pliers to do this. And then you want to add some glue. Now I just lightly press on it to follow the curve of the ear. Press it the other way and then curve it again. So it should be like that. You want to keep in mind when adding the glue and then pressing it, the glue will heat up the wire, so you don't want to get so close to the glue spot. You want to kind of keep your fingers a good amount away so you don't accidentally burn yourself. Now that you have it tacked down, you want to go ahead and straighten it out again on the other side. And then I like to cut out this side the same length as the other side. I use these crescent snips. It actually comes in a 2-pack with 1 snip and 1 plier, and these are actually really nice for bending the wire, folding it down and snipping it. They're nice and small, and they also have like a spring on the back, so you don't have to like force them open and then redo it. They just automatically open back up. So I'll go ahead and snip like that, and then I'll cap off this end also. Now that you have the main frame done, you want to go ahead and get a pair of pliers and start from the inner corner edge, or this one if you want. And I like to bend it right where the insert ends, and bend it like that. And then you're gonna go ahead and do this one too. And then I'll get my finger and kind of press it in like a curve motion. That way it matches up to the bottom curve of the insert cutout, like that. You want to make sure they kind of align as close as you can get them, like so. So I like to get some measuring tape and kind of mark out where 1.5 inches is. This will vary for you depending on how much of a fold over you have, what kind of style of ear you're going for. But this is around the length that I like to kind of mark off where I'm going to glue down the wires. Maybe like that much. Okay, so a little bit less than 1.5 inches. And then I like to add a little dab of glue, or actually a bigger dab of glue, to make sure it's holding down both of the wires. And I'll make it about 1/2 inch long, making sure to kind of smooth out the edges. Once that is cooled down, you want to go ahead and press where you just glued it. Make sure it's cooled down, please. And then bend the wire down. So it's going like straight down like that. It might lift up the edges a little bit, so you're gonna want to add a little bit more glue right there. And now you can go back and just do like a quick little line along the edge of the rest of the pattern. That way the wire is nice and secure down. So now that you have your ear wired, you can go ahead and get the back and align it with the front. You want to make sure the edges of the fabric are aligned before you start gluing. Once they're aligned, you can go ahead and start off wherever you want and do it in little sections to glue it down. Once you have those pieces glued together, you want to get a pet wire brush. I like using this one. I wouldn't recommend using it on pets because it's so rough and there's no end caps on this, but it works perfectly for brushing out the fur and removing all tangles. I've tried using the ones with the plastic end caps and it doesn't seem to straighten out all the fur. So you want to brush it up, and then you want to go to the edges on the side and kind of pull it apart to see where you might have missed any spots with the glue, and go ahead and add a tiny bit of glue and press it together lightly. Now that you have double checked the edges, I like to go in with some scissors and look for any parts that aren't aligned properly, or like there's little bits of fabric that are higher like that, and I'll go ahead and just trim that off and go around the entire ear. You want to go ahead and brush out the ear once you trimmed it up and cleaned it up. And I like to separate the fur, so going in the opposite directions to expose the edge, the fabric edge. Missed a spot right there. Okay, so now that you've pretty much cleaned up all the edges and brushed out the fur, we're gonna go ahead and do the fold over edge on the side of the ear. So if you look at this piece right here, there's a section of the back fur that is folded over to the front to kind of create a seamless blend from the front and back fur. And there's not like a harsh line separating it, but kind of like a softer, smooth curve. So that's what we're gonna do on these ones. I actually have the size that I use on my measuring tape. It's a little bit underneath an inch, and I usually use this on most of the patterns. Unless they're bigger, then I'll go ahead and make this bigger, but for the most part it's this sizing that I use. You want to make sure you're measuring it out and you note that measurement somewhere so you can make each side even, instead of having one side like right here and then another side like all the way up here or all the way down here, since we're trying to make it as symmetrical as we can. So I'm gonna go ahead, press this down, and then hold it to where I'm going to trim it at. So it's gonna be about right there. And I'll go in slightly so you can see that the edge is right here, and I'll go in slightly with the scissors and kind of section out that fur all the way to that point that we measured out, and I'll go ahead and snip it off. You want to make sure you snip it off all the way to the base to where the fabric is, and make sure it is even. Now that you have this side done, you want to go ahead, brush out the other side. I like to brush it up and then out to make sure it's sectioned off right, and then I'll go ahead and section this side off the same thickness and the same height, but I'm not going to cut it. You see how I separated it with the scissors, and then I'll just go back in, making sure that it is kind of even throughout the entire side like that. So I have this little section sectioned off. Now you're gonna want to pull this up. I kind of pinch it at the end to make sure that it's gonna stay aligned and not flare out like that. Though if you want it that style, you can go ahead and do that if you want. And then I'll take the glue gun, and right on that strip that we trimmed, I'm gonna add a thin layer of glue. Now you want to do this part kind of quickly, so do that and then fold it over and kind of straighten it out where you need to. Don't pull so hard because you don't want to warp it, because you see how it's kind of a little bumpy. And I lightly press it so it goes around the edge. Don't worry about the glue that's coming out right there. You can just snip that off after. And then I like to go in with my nail and kind of press on that edge. Not up against it, but kind of where the trim section ends and the first starts. And then kind of pressing it to even it out again. Now, not all the fur is gonna stick, so you're gonna want to kind of lightly pull up any fur that didn't stick to push it back to the end, and then you can go ahead and press and shape it so it has a smoother shape. And right here you can see we have a tiny bit of glue that came out at the end. I'll just go ahead and snip that off. So now you have that fold over edge that's kind of round and pillowy. Now we're gonna go ahead and go on to seaming the edges. After brushing out the fur, you want to go ahead and go to the side again. And you want to section off about 1 inch to 2 inches, about the same like width as the fold over, but you're going to separate it like you did with the back and not trim it. And this is where the pointy tip on the scissors comes in handy to kind of section out the fur, making sure that it's even throughout. And then you'll go ahead and do that on the back as well. And I like to give it a quick brush just to make sure there's no kinks in the fur. And I kind of pull it with my fingers, like pinch it in between my fingers. You want to go ahead and get your glue gun. So what you're going to do is add a thin line of glue, then you're going to pull it up. And you're going to want to do this in kind of a quick motion and not let it sit for that long. So go ahead and place the glue. And then pull up and then lightly press. Now you can go in with pliers and do this. I'm just used to using my fingers for the longest time since I have to go through so many sets. And then I'll go in with some pliers and kind of smooth out any lumps that might have been left by the glue to make sure it's nice and smooth. And I press it so that the pliers doesn't get stuck to the glue and the fur. And just make sure that it is nice and smooth. So you should have a piece looking like that that's glued up. You can see where the fabric edge is at and where the fur has been glued straight up. And you're gonna wanna trim kind of outside of that fabric edge so you have a seam of fur there. And you kind of want to do this step quickly also, just because if it cools down, then it has a thicker edge than when you go in and snip it when it's slightly warm, because then when you're cutting it with the scissors, it'll actually pinch the edges closed more, so the edge is like really nice and clean. So, and you're gonna want to look at the seaming maps that I include in the package, and it'll show you how much I go up off of the edges. And right here, when you're starting, you want it to be flush. You see how it's like right where this fold over edge is at, it starts, but it's nice and smooth together to where there's not really a bump at all. You're gonna want to start off close and then lift up. The tip is usually the thickest point, then I shrink it down slightly as I go to this side, and then it should be even throughout. It does vary depending on the patterns. When it comes to the butterfly ones, it does have a little bit more detail and design to the seam edge. When connecting the sections, you want to do this part like regular and then go in with your pliers again and make sure you smush this previous section, like the end of it, with the beginning of this one, so it kind of melts the glue together and you don't have one seam section going this way and then the other one kind of bends or splits off the other way. That way it's just one solid line that goes and connects all the way around. Once you have the main outline done, you can go ahead and do the bottom. I recommend getting a thinner layer of fur for the bottom. That way you don't have like a thick line of like empty section. So yeah, go ahead and seam the bottom. Make sure you are doing it in the 3 sections that there is and not pulling the fur up over the wire and covering it. You kind of want to get the fur directly in between both wires and then seam it up that way. To make it easier when cutting out this middle section, you actually want to slightly bend the wire back and this one forward. That way you can get in there a lot easier, though you want to be careful pushing it too far back or too far forward, because it will rip the fabric and leave a hole in there. When sectioning out this part, you can see that the fur doesn't go all the way to the edge because that's where our fold over seam is at and we trimmed it. So when you lay out the glue, you want to lay it all on the bottom and then kind of pull it this way and press it down. That way it stretches and separates the fur to be able to cover that section also, just like that. So it reaches all the way to the edge because you angle it out. You can see this one's going straight back. Now you are done with seaming the edges. You can see that it looks a lot cleaner and neater. You want to brush it out, get any loose fur out. And now we are ready for trimming. I wanted to show you this setup that I made with a box to suck in the fur when you're trimming the ears. So the box is about 2.5 feet tall, and I reshaped it so that it is a foot wide on each side. And you can see that I cut a hole right here for the vacuum tube to go in. And then I made this cone shape out of paper that just slips over that vacuum tube. And what that does is creates a funnel for the fur to get sucked into. So when you're trimming, the fur is not flying all over in the air and you're not breathing it in. Also, when you trim over it, if it doesn't get sucked in, it'll just fall into the bottom of the box and you can just vacuum that out once you're done. So yeah, I highly recommend making something like this, or if you just have a fan by a window, that way you don't have fur flying all over in the air. Now that you have your ear seamed up, wired, and the inserts all in, you can get ready for trimming. So I already have the style of trimming that I like to do, so I'll be showing you that style on the Bixby ears. When it comes to the front fluff, there's so many ways to create your own style with that, so you can just use the main techniques off of this and kind of adjust it to the style that you want to do. So we're gonna take our sketch and you can kind of see the layout that I'm going for. If you did get the package, it should have the layout of the fluff pattern on most of our popular ears, so it'll let you know where we trim it at regularly. So when you start your trimming, you can kind of see right here, I like to block it out into 3 main sections. That way I can get it as even or symmetrical on both ears, while also getting majority of the fur trimmed and only needing to do a little bit when it comes to detailing. But you still want to take it slow because one wrong trim will completely ruin the entire ear where you have to restart. So I recommend going in little sections when you're first learning, that way you don't accidentally trim off stuff that you don't want to trim off. So when you look at this sketch, you can kind of see there's a main curve to the fluff right here. So there's a main outline that I like to follow, and I'll first trim off this section so that I have this fluff left over, and then I'll make it symmetrical on the other ear, and then I'll go in at a slight angle and trim off the fluff right here so that this middle section is cleared. And then for this one specifically, I have to go in a 3rd time, and I'll go in right here at an angle and trim off this section. That way you have your 3 main parts fully blocked off, and then you just need to go up and clean up the edges slightly. So I'm gonna go ahead and do this first part and then show you how that turns out. When trimming with the scissors, you want to make sure that you are getting as close to the fabric as you can, and you want to avoid trimming any of this fur because this is what you will use to style the fluff. Now I have the outer edge trimmed up, so you can see that I curved it just like the sketch so that it goes around the main outline of the fluff. Now I'm going to go in at an angle and trim out this section to separate this fluff from the other two parts. Now you can see it is at an angle going down maybe like a ½ inch wide to an inch wide. I have fluff that usually comes up to this section. That's why I like to do it on an angle so it doesn't trim that off, but I can still get the majority of the fur trimmed off and the fluff outlined in these first steps. So now I'm gonna go ahead and go at an angle right here. So depending on how much fluff you want right here, so if you want it cut off right there, you'll do a more like an angle going like that. But if you want it longer, you'll go ahead and do a longer angle, leaving more space underneath. So now you have your 3 main fluff pieces separated. It's okay if this isn't trimmed down all the way. We'll go in with the clippers and do that to clean it up, or if you're just going to use scissors, you'll go in once we finish sectioning off the fluff. And you can see that all of this fur is still long. I'm not cutting into the ends of the sectioned off fluff. That'll be until the end where you can go ahead and style it. I'm gonna go ahead and clean up the sections, and then we'll move on to the trimming. Now, this is what we're left with. You can see I rounded off the bottom, smoothed off the top, and rounded off this corner, as well as cleaning up this edge. And then when it comes to this fluff, I like to kind of curve it under because I like to have it curving out. So I'll clean it up underneath with a curve also, making sure to leave enough thickness to style the fluff. You don't want to make it too thin because then it doesn't look as good. But again, if you're trying to go for like a more thinner, spiky look, that might work perfectly for you. So now that we have this section off, this is when I'll go in with the clippers to trim close to the fabric. So wherever we trimmed off the fur, you want to clean up that edge first before moving on to styling. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that now. So I have it all trimmed up and close to the fabric, making sure to go all the way to the edges. There was a part I did not glue down properly, so it actually cut a hole into the fabric. I would either discount this set if it didn't have crystals, and I didn't. So now I have it all trimmed up. You can see it's up close, just the fabric. I'll start. Okay, so now they're all trimmed up from the empty sections. You can see it's all the way up against the fabric. Make sure to go on the edges. I didn't glue this one down correctly, and you can see my trimmers ended up cutting a hole into the fabric. So I would either have to remake this set, discount it, or if I was adding crystals or charms, you can just add a crystal and charm over it because it'll just block it out. But Yeah, otherwise this is a defective set. So you want to make sure that you're not angling the trimmers too sharply into the fabric and that you have the front glued down. Since I didn't glue down this part properly, there's a kind of a bubble where the fabric is lifting up and it snagged onto it and just ripped a hole right through. So now that we have that trimmed up, we're gonna go ahead and detail the fluff. So I like to do this edge fluff first, and what I'll do is I'll get my trimmers and I'll kind of swipe from the base but not all the way to the fabric, just slightly higher, and then kind of go in a swooping motion upwards, and it'll create a sloping effect to, or like a fade to short fur to longer fur. So I'll do that on that part, and then when it comes to this section, I'll go ahead and get my scissors. You're gonna want to curve it when you're cutting this section, that way you know exactly how it's gonna sit when the ear is posed. And then I'll go ahead and kind of trim outside, a little bit outside of where the fluff is, so kind of outline it the same way that we did this part. I'll do that with this fluff, so I'll trim it like that, and then I'll go in with the thinning shears and I'll kind of go in at an angle, and let's see if I can do this. I'll go in, close, and pull out, and do that to get a spiky effect so it's more fluffy instead of a harsh line. And same for this one, I'll go ahead and do an outline, a rough outline, and then go in with the thinning shears. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that and come back. This is just the fluff with the rough outline blocked out, so you can see it's very harsh lines, and then you can go ahead and go in with your thinning shears and just thin out this edge, kind of creating a more fluffy look. Make sure to move back and forth, that way it doesn't pull out too much fur out of one section. And you can even see, just from doing that little bit, you can see how it's fluffy compared to this section. This one's more of a fluffy, spiky look instead of just a really blunt edge cut. And you're gonna want to go ahead and do that wherever you want that look at. I like to go along right here, leave this a little bit longer, go slightly underneath here, and then all throughout here, and then throughout here. So I'm gonna go do that. Now the fluff is styled. I went ahead and detailed it. I also went in right here and kind of shaved it with the trimmers like I did right here, just to thin it out on the bottom, so when it folds over it has more of a curve to it. You can kind of see how it curves over. And when it comes to styling, you just want to play with it a little bit, kind of twist the ends to get like these little spiky bits. You can kind of twist the fluff just to style it a little bit more. And there you go. So now that we have the front done, we can go ahead and go to the back. Now, when it comes to the back, you want to keep the ear in this shape, in the shape that it will be posed in once you're done. So you can see with this one, the back fluff is showing in the front, right here and right here. Now, depending on how your design looks, this will be different on how much fluff comes out, if you want it long, spiky, or if you don't want any of that fluff showing at all. Again, I'll be showing you on the Bixby set how we do the fluff. Now, you're gonna want to brush it out, making sure there's no tangles or knots. And I kind of pull out these side edges because this is what's gonna stick out anyway. And then I'll go ahead and roughly trim starting about here, because you can see that about at this point there's no fluff up here. And then when it comes to the back, I actually do have a bit of fluff right there. So you're gonna wanna stop right here also. So I go in kind of at a curve and trim the perimeter so that the majority of the fur is cut off right there, because it's not gonna be there anyway because we trim it down short for the tips. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. You can see I just did the outline of the tips. Depending on how you want the back fluff to look, we have this style where it kind of curves down. Let me get a different set actually. So we have this style where it just curves down, and once it gets about like an inch from the base, it has longer fur, which you can brush it downwards and it'll fluff down like that, or we just normally keep it brushed up like this and it creates a little lip of long fur. You can also make this spiky, so on our Fonzie sets, on the back it's a bit longer and more spikier. To do that, you're gonna want to section out that section. Let me do it on this one. You're gonna want to section out that part and brush it down and separate it and trim that last. Though I'm probably actually gonna do that right now to show you. So you can see where this fluff ends. I'm gonna go in above at an angle, curving up and going around, and kind of ending at this fold over seam. And I'm just gonna separate that. So once you have that separated, I actually like to go in with some paper tape. This one doesn't have a strong adhesive on it, so it's nice when you stick it on the fur, it's not gonna get any glue stuck onto it. And I'll actually go in, brush this down a little bit more, and then brush this one up. And separate it like that and kind of wrap it around. That way you have this section that you can work with, because you're going to be trimming this with the trimmers. Again, you want to keep in mind the fluff that is poking out from the front. You're not going to want to trim this off with the trimmers, but you're going to want to closely trim up here and kind of fade it down, but making sure not to get all the way close to this edge, only to the tip edge. So let me get the trimmers. And you're gonna want to first go in a downward motion, starting from the tip and swooping up. You can see I just did the edge and I haven't brushed it out or anything. It's just kind of in an upward motion that I swooped, Not all the way, I just made sure to clean up the edges, so now you have a clean edge. I also didn't go all the way down to like right here or right here because I still want fluff peeking out from the front, so I don't want to trim the sections where the fluff will be connected to the parts that are going to be peeking out. So once you have the edge seam cleaned up, you're going to go ahead and go in the opposite direction, making sure to start higher and then go lower. And do this in small bits because you don't want to trim too much of the fur off. The trimmers that I have a high and a low setting. You're going to want to do the low setting for this part. You can also use the high setting for this part, but I recommend starting off with the low setting because just like you've seen, you don't want to cut a hole off, and even though I've made so many ears, I still cut a hole in the thing time to time. So yeah, you're gonna want to use the low setting going the opposite direction now. You can see after doing the first pass on the trim, it's a lot smoother. It's more thicker on here, but slightly. We still gotta go in and clean up the edge, but if you look right here, let's see if you can get a better look. When I trimmed, I kind of lifted up off when I was doing these sections. That way you leave that fluff. So you see how it's still peeking out, but then it's smooth and it connects to the flat trim section. And then you'll go in with scissors, clean up the edges. You can go in with the trimmers and go sideways like this to get that little ridge that gets created when you go the opposite direction, just to clean it up. I'm gonna go ahead and do that and then show you how to trim this bottom part. Now that tip edge is cleaned up and you can see how it's smooth and a nice transition to the thin edge. Still leaving these long. I haven't styled these yet because we're gonna do that at the end. Now you can take off the tape off of the fur. You can see it doesn't leave any residue or rip out the fur like crazy. Now if you like a longer style, you can go ahead and leave it like this and then just clean up, pull this back slightly and trim this little edge up, or you can go ahead and trim it down shorter with the scissors and then go ahead and thin it out to fluff it out. You can also go in with the trimmers and kind of trim that curved edge. That way it blends into it, but you still have that little section of long fur. So I'm gonna go ahead and rough trim it and then I'll show you how that looks. So you can see I just did a curve in the center. I didn't go all the way to the edges just because I want the fluff to be long right there. And then I'll go ahead and thin this out. And once you thin it out or get it to the style that you want this lower section, you can go ahead and turn around the ear, brush it out, and pull it out sideways, the fluff. And this is when I'll go in with the scissors and then detail trim it, so to get that curve, and then go ahead and thin it out if it needs to be thinned out. I ended up keeping the side fluffs long and not really styling it that much because since the longer style, you can already see it naturally has that spiky kind of look. I left this side more blunt since I like a harsher line on this side. I lightly went in with the thinning shears to soften up the line right here. I cleaned it up a little bit with the trimmers. Going on this side. And yeah, so now you have your base ear. And before you move on to airbrushing, I actually like to go on this section specifically. I don't do it to this one, only this one, but I'll get a brush and brush this up and then brush this section back. So the fluff right here that's peeking over, and then the fluff on the back that's peeking over. And I'll actually put a thin line of glue, and then press it down so that it sticks and it's permanently styled, so it is peeking out from the back and it doesn't like accidentally go like that, and it's kind of just stuck in a styled position. Once I do the back, I'll go ahead and do this little section right here. Make sure it's brushed out, add the glue, and then put it like that. That way it just blends the back and the front fur a lot better, and you don't see the seam right there. It kind of just pops out of the fluff. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that, and then we're ready to get to painting. So you can see that the fluff is now attached, and it's kind of just forever like posed. You still have to brush it out to like straighten out any kinks and stuff, but for the most part it is styled there. And then you can see right here how it merges, and then you have the seam that just pops out in between. This one you want to leave long again. And before moving on to the paint section, you actually want to go in with the vacuum and remove any of the short fur, or you can go in with your finger or whatever else, like maybe a bristle brush would work also. And you want to remove the fur that was trimmed and is stuck to the ear. So as you see, when I wipe my finger on the edge, you can see all this fur that is coming up off of the fabric, and these are all the trimmed pieces. And you want to make sure to remove as much as you possibly can, especially out of the fluff. So you want to brush the fluff, pull on the fluff to get any loose pieces, and then vacuum it, and then brush it again, just to make sure you got out all those little tiny snipped pieces of fur. That way it creates a nice smooth canvas to airbrush on, because when you airbrush onto that loose fur, it becomes clumpy, and then it like thickens those little cut pieces of fur, kind of like mascara, like on eyelashes, how it makes it like really chunky. So you want to make sure to remove that, all the loose fur that you can. Now, when you go onto the painting the step, you want to prep the ear first. So you can see that I have a cream white base on the front. I'm gonna go in with a white paint and actually airbrush all around on the flat section, not really on the fluff, but on like the flat sections, to even out the color, because you can kind of see how the insert is peeking through the fabric and it's a harsh white line. You want to airbrush it to even it, so then the entire tone all the way to the edge seam is a solid color. So you want to go ahead and do that in maybe 2 to 3 layers, 3 layers maximum, but make sure that the layers are thin. You want to let them dry 15 to 20 minutes in between before going on to the next layer. That way it gives it some time to dry and it doesn't clump up. You're trying to make the layers as thin as possible so the paint doesn't start running into other sections or just looking really messy and muddy. Once you get the base layers done, you want to go ahead and actually mix your paint palette, what colors you're going to be using, and testing it out. So I have a couple swatches here that I use to airbrush some ears, and you can kind of see the mixes that I did. So this is for like a pastel rainbow set. I probably did this for like the rainy days ears, and then this is for a commission. You can see it was a lot of shades of yellow, orange, and red. Right here you got shades of purple to pink, and then we have some more natural like green blue tones, some brown tones, blue tones, and then pink purple tones. You want to do this and test out your colors before you go onto the ear, because if you're mixing the colors right off the bat, sometimes certain colors you might think it's going to come out a specific way, but then it completely comes out a different way, and then you have to clean out your airbrush because the color is completely wrong. So I recommend testing it out on a sheet. These are also sheets that I use while I'm airbrushing, so I'll put like globs of paint. You can also use a wet paint palette, but I'll put globs of paint of the colors that I'll be using. I'll have a small brush similar to this one, and I'll just scoop it up. I'll put a couple drops of the main color, which is usually white, and or like a creamy pastel color. I'll use a brush to scoop up a little bit of the darker colors I'm mixing in, mix it in, and then let me get my nozzle actually. So this is my airbrush. I use an Iwata one, Iwata Eclipse. This is actually like a really expensive one, but I used to use the Badger ones from Michael's a lot, but they always got clogged up and they didn't get that tiny of a spray. So I really love doing more smaller details on sets. So this one's actually really perfect. And just a little tip, if you want to get even tinier spray, you want to unscrew the nozzle. Most airbrushes have a little nozzle like this at the tip that unscrews. Be careful because the needle actually pokes through right here, and this needle is so easy to dent. That's why I recommend having spare parts at all times, and the second you use the spare, you order another one. So you can airbrush like this and you'll get an even tinier spray. But yeah, I'll go ahead and put the main base, a couple drops. Since we're airbrushing ears, we don't use that much paint, and it'll only take a couple drops and then like a little swipe of some color to mix in, and mix in the colors. And I'll go ahead and mix it in the pot, and then you'll want to put a cap on, paper towel, or something to cover it, and you'll put your finger right here and then press it backwards lightly, and it'll blow the air back into the little cup right here and kind of mix the paint more. So that's a good little tip too for mixing it, making sure that the paint at the end of the nozzle is mixed also. Instead of putting in your base, mixing it on top, it looks mixed, but then when you spray it, it's just the base color that's coming out because the brush didn't reach all the way in. So you want to make sure to press it, pull it back, also have it covered and mix it up a little bit more. Once you have the palette or the colors that you're gonna use, if you're doing like a single color, so let's say if we're doing a mint ear and majority of the color is just mint, it's just gonna be all mint with some cream on it, you want to do multiple shades of that mint. So you want to have some lighter shades and then slowly going to a darker shade. I usually like to do a couple shades darker than the fur, but for like little corner details to kind of carve out the edges of the fluff, I like to do maybe 4 to 5 shades darker. And you want to have anywhere from 3 to 5 different shades that you're using for a single color set, just because it looks so much better when you have that blended edge compared to just using a single color and kind of fading it out from the edge and concentrating it more for like the darker sections. If you're doing rainbow, you don't have to have so many shades. If anything, just one of each for the rainbow specifically is good enough. And then any outer edge, you can use like 2 shades to shade around the perimeter of the ear. When it comes to paints, I love to use the Golden High Flow acrylics. They work the best for me. They also they're not like as latexy, and they don't clog up the airbrush as bad. But make sure you're cleaning out your airbrush often, because it is a pain in the butt to get out paint off of a hard nozzle majority of the time. If it dries down in that nozzle, since the tip is so tiny, you're gonna have to buy a new one, because just cleaning it out can dent it, and that'll affect the spray. So if you're trying to do like a straight line, it's gonna be very, very wonky. So I recommend Golden High Flow acrylics. And when it comes to the airbrush cleaner, I found that this what brand is it? The Media airbrush cleaner is actually the best one so far. I highly recommend this one. I know people recommend using like Windex and stuff like that, but for some reason it leaves like a sticky residue, and this doesn't leave a sticky residue as long as you just spray it all out. If you leave a puddle in there, it'll leave a little bit, but as long as you just spray it out of the thing, the rest will evaporate, and it really cleans up the paint really good off of the airbrush and off of the brushes too. So I highly recommend that airbrush cleaner specifically. When it comes to airbrushing, you really can take it whichever way that you want. I'm not going to airbrush this set since this is just a tester set. You can go ahead and look at my Instagram and you can see all the sets that we've made and kind of use the photos as references on how to place the colors. So you can see right here on this set, I did pink and then the blonde, kind of ashy blonde color, and I used 3 shades of pink, so lightest in the center and then medium and then getting darker and then darker, the darkest on like these corners. And then for the back I used a light shade on the edge, I used a darker shade on the tip, and then darker right here to kind of blend it up so it just has a more seamless look from the front to the back. I'll do the tips a little bit darker also, and then use a shade similar to this one for the edges. Don't forget to do the bottom. If you're doing floating tips, make sure to get these edges also. That way it's not you don't see like the fabric edge sticking out. So now that you have a good base structure of the ears, you can go ahead and focus more on the creative designing process. When it comes to designing the ears, it really is limitless. Don't feel like you need to stay within a certain box because they can be whatever you want them to be. I plan on selling some of our most popular ear design patterns. That way you can create our ears in your unique style. I'll have that down in the description below, or check out our Instagram for more information. I hope you found this video helpful and have fun creating your own unique fur ears. Bye.